The Gurdjieff Experience by Toomer. It will be remembered that, on leaving the University of Wisconsin and returning home, I started on my way to chaos. Through the years that followed, I got bumped and broken, mentally and emotionally. Only my body held out. Spiritually, I was plunged into the fundamental problems of this era, and the plunge, though invaluable as a means to the expansion of my consciousness and my conscious individualization, dislocated my parts. This dislocation, together with the accompanying need to integrate myself, persisted in my inner life even while exteriorly I achieved some measure of order, balance and direction. I was a bit of chaos dressed in formal attire. Or, to be accurate, I should say that the dislocation persisted off and on, sometimes being resolved in the intensity of a period of functioning, but then coming into evidence again when such a period passed. During the winter of 1923, owing to a complex of causes, my writing stopped, and my disharmony became distressingly prominent. So it became clear that my literary occupations had not worked deep to make of me an integrated man. Had it done so for others? Now I looked questioningly not at the book, but at the writer of it. This was an heretical focus. Only their liking for me kept my colleagues from pronouncing excommunication. What I saw, or believed I saw, was at once disquieting and challenging. I saw that these people, writers and artists, men and women, were much like myself with respect to the chaos of their personal lives, but that, unlike myself, they were unwilling, or in any case uneager, to search for a whole way of living that would make them whole. True, some of them talked about it. Some of them talked about the end of a direction and a new slope of consciousness. Few of them felt the urgent need to do anything about it. They suffered, therefore, and their art too. Great art, I was convinced, could issue only from great human beings. Small men could not produce really big books. Twisted, faltered, confused men could only express their confusion. The resistance of my fellows further aroused me. I talked to them and thus talked to myself. I studied them and thus learned about myself. I urged them and thus urged myself. Old sayings came to my mind as if they were my sayings. Physician, heal thyself. Know thyself. The first duty of an artist in a sick world is to become well, and the like. I became the champion of something non-literary, non-artistic, and, I must confess, at that time unknown to myself. I must also confess that I became a sort of Socratic pest. I realize it now, looking back. They were still writing, even if I was not. They were still going on in their way, bumpily and circular though it was, even if I had come to the dead end of a direction and realized that the course of my life had led through mazes into a blind alley. I should have let them alone. True, a pest to most of my colleagues, but a discoverer to myself. I was working something out. In the course of this work I came to certain realizations that prepared for the revolution of my life. The modern world was uprooted. The modern world was breaking down, but we couldn't go back. There was nothing to go back to. Besides, in our hasty leaps into the future we had burned our bridges. The soil, the earth, was still there, even under city pavements and congested skyscrapers. But such peasantry as America had had, and I sang one of its swan songs in Cain, was swiftly disappearing, swiftly being industrialized and urbanized by machines, motor cars, phonographs, movies. Back to nature, even if desirable, was no longer possible, because industry had taken nature unto itself. Even if he wanted to, a city person could not become a soil person by changing his locale and living on a farm or in the woods. So then, whether we wished to or not, we had to go on. We had to go on and accept the task of creating a human world that was at least as conducive to man's well-being and growth as the world of nature was conducive to the growth of plant and animal life. The creation of a human world, this was our task. Those who sought to cure themselves by a return to more primitive conditions were either romantics or escapists. We had to project real values and then realize them in full-bodied life. And this included everyone in America and everyone in Western civilization who had arisen, or who had been pushed, above the grass line. So I sought for the means of going on. I would work to be able to contribute my share to the building of a functioning civilization in these modern times. I too, because I must be, would be a builder of the world. This was my general outlook, my general stand. The problems of life were not respecters of colours or of racial groups. The basic problems of modern life had caught up white and coloured alike, Northerners and Southerners, Americans and Europeans. These problems were the modern boat. Everyone was in this boat. Each one had to pull his oar, else we sink. The task of solving them was at every man's door, in his house, in his body and soul. Specific problems like race problems, nationality problems, and others which were outgrowths of the general condition could move towards a fruitful resolution only on the condition that the general basic issues were thus moved. Any attempt to solve a specific issue on the assumption that it was isolated, could be cured by itself, was foredoomed to failure. On this ground I rejected such attempts, without of course denying that they sometimes had good and necessary immediate effects in the matter of improving practical day-to-day living conditions. The basic issues were, in my view, 1. Economic, and 2. Psychological and spiritual. Our economic system had run away with itself and was doing damage not only to the proletarians and the petty bourgeoisie, but to the capitalists as well. All classes and all groups were involved in the mutilation. Our psyches were split and chaotic, our spirits were shrunken, our souls were empty. To compensate for this emptiness, to avenge our tortured, slow deaths, we had grown fangs and sacs of poison, and we used these fangs, race fangs, sex fangs, class fangs, national and religious fangs, all manner of personal fangs, with typical man insanity against each other. The unhappy person, unless great, is poisonous. The happy person, even if small, is sweet. It is not reasonable to expect that a man who is being destroyed will help others to live. So what? 1. A constructive change of the economic system. I, however, had no special talent in the field. From experience, temperament and interest it was not my field, except in so far as I, together with everyone else, was involved in it. Hence my contribution at best would be minor. Hence I would leave this field to others and concern myself with the issues which, more and more, I had come to realize I could handle best, namely the psychological, spiritual issues. Because of my personal experience, my ups and downs, my I am I states, and my I am nothing states, I was fairly well convinced that in man there was a curious duality, an I, a something that was not I, an inner being, an outer personality. I was further convinced that the inner being was the real thing, that the outer personality was the false thing, that the I was the source of life, that the personality was the sac of poison. The question was how to bring man together into an integrated, complete whole. My answer was by increasing the I while at the same time eliminating the personality. But I had no method, no means of doing this. Also, because of my personal experiences, my disorganization of parts, I was convinced that the parts of man, his mind, emotions and body, were radically out of harmony with each other. But how to bring them into harmony? I did not have a means of doing this. I discussed these matters with almost everyone I came in contact with. To me, they were the really vital matters, and my heart and mind were concentrated on them. Nobody could help me. Many people did not even get the point. Each one, himself a specialist and therefore lopsided, was content to pursue his speciality, achieve, if he could, some distinction in it, and let the rest, namely his whole life, go hang. It was just at this time that first A R Orage and then Gurdjieff himself came to America. A pamphlet of the Gurdjieff Institute came into my hands. In it I found expressed, more completely and with more authority than with anything possible from me, just the conditions of man which I myself had realized. Moreover, a method, a means of doing something about it was promised. It was no wonder that I went heart and soul into the Gurdjieff work. Here was a work that gave man direction and helped him move on the way out of the chaos of modern civilization. Here was a work that indicated what must be done in order to achieve a balanced development. Here was work whose scope was greater and more complete than anything I dreamed of. Here, in fine, was truth. That summer I went to the Institute at Fontainebleau, prepared to stay there or in some similar place for the rest of my life, or in any case until I had fulfilled my human needs as far as possible under those extraordinary conditions. After a time, because of a motor accident to himself, Gurdjieff closed the Institute. I remained there a month or so longer and then returned to America and became a member of the groups then being conducted by Orage. These groups and the life that grew out of them became my life. I was worlds removed from the literary set. I knew little or nothing of what was happening in it. That I had once written a book called Cain seemed remote. What had happened to it I neither knew nor cared. Much less I knew of what was happening in the Negro world. Gradually, however, I began making other contacts. I began awakening with interest to the wide activities of that time. Then I discovered, among other things, that a ferment was in the Negro world also, a literary ferment, and that it was producing a new literature. I was sufficiently moved to write an article. After this I viewed the movement as a splendid thing, but as something that had no special meaning for me. Time passed. The next I knew I received a visit from Alan Locke. Locke said he was getting together a book of Negro material and wanted something I'd written, preferably a new story or a story from Cain. I realized that I'd written no new stories of that kind and did not want Cain dismembered. He pressed. I thought of the article. I offered it to him. It turned out that he did not want it. My expressed attitude was, this article or nothing. I concluded that the matter was finished. Before Locke left, he talked to me about Winold Rice, the artist. He said Rice was doing interesting things and had expressed a desire to do a portrait of me. He urged me to sit for Rice, never mentioning that he himself would use the portrait in his book. Out of curiosity or vanity or something, I did sit for Rice, and, so far as I knew, that was that. But when Locke's book, The New Negro, came out, there was the Rice portrait, and there was a story from Cain, and there, in an introduction, were words about me which have caused as much or more misunderstanding than Waldo Frank's. However, there was and is, among others, this great difference between Frank and Locke. Frank helped me at a time when I most needed help. I will never forget it. Locke tricked and misused me. For a short time after the appearance of Locke's book I was furious because I felt blocked. I could not take my article and portrait out of it. I could not, without risk of putting myself in a false light, publicly explain the trick that had been played on me. My dear enemies, those who like to misrepresent me, would have echoed Horace Liveright and said at once, Toomer wants to deny his race. To have said the thing right, I would have had to write something not much less than my autobiography. Well, I shrugged and let it drop, but not without a pretty sharp sense of the irony of the situation. My writing, namely the very thing that should have made me understood, was being so presented and interpreted that I was now much more misunderstood in this respect than at any other time of my life. Yet even this misunderstanding did not strike me as being serious when my emotions called. I was living in New York. So far as I knew, I would never live anywhere else permanently. I had my life and work. So far as I could foresee, I would have no other life or work. I had my friends and our sufficiently absorbing activities. The racial thing, insofar as it had existed, had its proportioned place in the scale of values, and this was all I asked. It made no difference what I was called. The label Negro was of no more consequence than any other. At times, however, I did have a feeling that I was letting the thing slide, and I had a feeling that the slide was gathering momentum. When such feelings come to me, I thought about the situation with some concern. I felt I ought to do something. I felt I should write a book stating who and what I actually was. It was now clear to me that if I didn't, surely no one else would, and why should they? I cannot tell why I did not write that book then. Perhaps it was because I sincerely felt that it didn't matter. Perhaps it was because I did not want to put such emphasis on this one thing, which in my actual life from day to day was not emphatic. Perhaps I foresaw that my book might cause even more misunderstanding, though of a different kind. I was, as you can see, in a difficult position. Perhaps the simple truth is that I was not equal to the handling of it. It would be a difficult book to write. It still is. The following is a poem by Toomer called Men. Different in persons, diverse in minds, friends in understanding, exiles in self, antagonists in egotism, brothers in being, enemies in greed, dull in routine, lovers in beauty, separate in bodies, many in desires, one in ultimate reality, strangers on the earth, prisoners in this world, natives of deity.